One of the questions I get quite a bit from Christians is, why should we care about fatherhood? Shouldn't our strategy and our mission really be focused on the Great Commission and winning souls? And shouldn't that be like the primary priority or the thing that we're concerned about? And I thought about this question in the context of something that happened to my wife several years ago. My wife was in the Air Force, and she had a friend who wasn't a Christian that she would take to lunch from every now and then. And one day she took her out to lunch. Now, my wife is one of these folks that sees God in everything. And when she prays, she's one of those, like mosquitoes, those are God's bloodsuckers, So she's praying with this friend, and when she's done, she looks up, and, the friend's not a Christian. She says, you've got a really strange look on your face. And she says, well, were you offended by my prayer? And the woman said to her, no, I wasn't offended by your prayer, but you started, Dear Heavenly Father, and I could never start a prayer that way because my father was such a blank blank. And it really struck me, and this was even long before I came to work for NFI, that the way that we relate to each other, the way that we don't relate, in many cases, has a lot to do with what's happening around this issue of fatherhood. Let me explain a little bit. This concept of a heavenly father is really a Christian concept. It's really a core Christian concept. But the notion of a heavenly father is an anathema and really has no meaning for someone that really doesn't, it may not have meaning for someone who doesn't really know what a loving father is. In fact, if you think about it, if they had a father that was so terrible, was absent, then the notion of a heavenly father may be even worse. I mean, from their perspective, they'd rather not have it. And so in a sense, when you're having these conversations, you may, in a sense, be adding to insult when you talk about this notion of fatherhood. See, we live in a nation right now where 24 million kids are growing up in homes absent their fathers. And, the strategy of trying to reach these kids, in my view, becomes much more complex. Because I believe kids have a hole in their soul in the shape of their dad. I believe that. I believe that God whispers into the wombs of their mothers that there's this guy that will love them like no other. And then when a father is unable or unwilling to do that, it leaves a wound that's not easily healed. See, I'm a wounded soul. So it caused me to leave Goldman Sachs for the lucrative world of nonprofit management. Right? This notion of wanting to make sure that others didn't experience what I experienced. And the interesting thing, from a Christian perspective, and certainly when you look at Jesus, he actually used this fatherhood theme as a way to build a relationship with community. It was really an evangelistic tool for him. Second, the epidemic of father absence, in my view, is not really a coincidence. I believe it's part of the enemy's plan, that if fathers are abusive, disconnected, it's problematic. Let's make no mistake about this. We did a national survey called Pop's Culture, and when we asked fathers about the father absence crisis, 91% strongly agree that we have a father absence crisis. We did another one called Mama Says just this year. We asked mothers, and they said exactly the same thing. See, people understand that there's a father absence crisis. But why attack fathers? Well, I think one of the most powerful things that someone needs to hear to be saved is that God is a good father and that he has a plan for your life. And his plan is to bring his children back to himself. Third, when you talk about preaching the gospel, for me this is a really interesting point because, talk about the preaching the gospel, there's the story in the Bible about the parable of the sower, and, there's the ground, there's the sower, and then there's the seed. And that the ground that really produces the good return is the one that has the good soil. So there's nothing wrong with the word. There's nothing even wrong with the sower. The issue has to do with the soil. And so the strategy from my perspective, and a real big part of being a Christian, in my view, is preparing the ground. There's this notion of saving grace, which all of us are probably familiar with. But there's also this notion of common grace. That's when the sun comes up and shines on everyone equally. And I believe that fatherhood embodies both. Because when you help kids have the kinds of fathers that are modeling the kinds of behavior that really leads them to this notion of a heavenly father, in my view, you prepare them for having the saving grace that a lot of us spend our time talking about. Now, it's interesting. There's a passage in the Bible where Jesus actually is talking to fathers. And you're probably familiar with this. He asks this question. He says, which of you, if your child asks you for bread, would give him a stone? Remember that verse? What's interesting, Because I started to think about that in the context of the day. That bread and a stone, they probably look the same. They feel the same, but they're not the same. See, one brings life, the bread of life. The other can be a tool of destruction. Remember, it was a stone that killed Stephen. A stone becomes a stumbling block, like it was for this friend of my wife. A stone can fall into your shoe, and at first it doesn't hurt. First it hurts, and then after a while you get used to it, right? And it becomes a callus, and you grow callous. And I believe that that's one of the challenges that we face right now with so many of our kids. Finally, as I close, another thing that really struck me is I give talks about this quite a bit. There's a wonderful example in the Bible of what earthly fathers are supposed to be. It's in Matthew, and it talks about the baptism of Jesus. Here's Jesus. He's being baptized, and the sky opens up, and then there's dove lights on him, and then the Heavenly Father says, "This is my Son, whom I love, with whom I'm well pleased." Well, you know what happens next, and Jesus is led out into the desert to be tempted in all ways just as we, but yet without sin. And what God gave me when I thought about this verse recently was this notion of affirmation before temptation. See, here was Jesus, fully man and fully God, but God the Father knew the power of a father's affirmation. I started to think about all the kids, not just in the U.S., but in the world, they've never heard, "This is my son, this is my daughter, whom I love." Affirmation before temptation. See, because Jesus was not tempted by any of these things because he knew what the real thing, he knew who he was and he knew whose he was. See, when you know the real thing, when you have the real thing, when you've experienced the real thing, no imitation will do. See, every drug dealer, pimp, hustler, they all get this. I spend my time talking to PhDs, DDs, MDs. The no Ds got this down. They understand this. Gangs are fatherhood replacement vehicles. I moved to Philadelphia. Moved from Philadelphia to the Washington, D.C. area right around the time of the D.C. sniper shootings. Now, I lived in Philadelphia. That is a city of brotherly love. No one dies there. There are no murders. We actually have Love Park in Philadelphia. I moved down to D.C. right in the middle of the D.C. sniper shootings. When I moved down there, just doing things that you never even think about becomes acts of courage. You pull up to pump gas in your car, and you see these dads kind of sitting in the car, and they're like, well, who's going to get out and pump? And it's just scary stuff. And maybe one of the boys should get out. It's a great learning opportunity for them, and plus they're quick. You know how it goes, right? Well, I remember the day when they caught Lee Malvo, who was called John Lee Malvo at the time, and John Muhammad. Not far from my house, interestingly. And I remember hearing the story that it was this older guy and this young kid. And I thought to myself, there's a fatherhood story in here somewhere. Well, a couple of days later, in the Washington Post, the story came out. Malvo's father came out and said hadn't seen him in years. As you unpack the story, you find out this wasn't a crime of anything else but a crime of fatherlessness. See, because they interviewed the psychiatrist that represented Malvo at his trial. And she said, one of the first things I asked him was, why did you do this? And he was sort of like the prodigal son at this point. He was starting to figure out, and he was trying to come back to himself, and he was starting to figure out what had happened to him. And he said to her, I would have done anything he asked me to do. He knew my weakness. He knew I didn't have a father. He knew I had a hole in my soul. And he knew exactly how to fill it. So from my perspective, this is an issue where Christians should be leading the way, should be responding to this crisis. And by and large, churches are not. If you think about our churches, there are three populations Jesus was the Bible was very specific that the church should be concerned about. The poor, hey, we're on that like a cheap suit on a warm September day, right? Very cheap suit. The widows, you don't have to worry about them. The sisters in the church will take care of the widows. But what's the other population? It's the orphans, the fatherless. Now, do we know who they are in our church? What's the connection between the men's ministry and the children's ministry? In most churches, none. We're not standing in the gap. And as you know, if there's no watchman on the wall, the gates are wide open. So therefore, from my perspective, this is an issue that is critically important. But it's one that's also solvable. See, I'm fond of saying that every kid has an involved father at conception. I'll let that settle in a little bit. There we go. Yeah, okay, got that. Right? The question is, will a kid have an involved father at graduation? That's the question. And this isn't an issue just out in the community. This is an issue that's in the church. See, because one of the things that became very clear to me as I started to look at fathers, even in the Bible, that so many of the fathers who were, I think there's this notion that if you're a good Christian, that means you'll be a good father. It's two very different things. If you're a good Christian man, that means you'll be a good father. It's two very different things. Manhood, in many ways, is about, it's a different kind of thing. There's nothing that makes you other-centered like being a father. Like you're a guy walking down the street, there's a bunch of other guys standing on the corner. You're a single guy, you're like, what's up, what's up? You go on and do your thing. Become a father. Who are they? What are they doing? How long they're going to be there? What's going on here? There's something that triggers in the head of a man when he becomes a father. And we've got an opportunity to step into this gap. And this isn't just a U.S. issue. This is a worldwide issue that we're dealing with here. And it's going to require a worldwide response. But the beauty of this is that it's possible and it's doable. Because I really believe that this work of connecting fathers to children is not just something that you do in addition to the gospel, but it is central to the gospel. It's a central part of the gospel because it's a mechanism that gives us the ability to sow into the hearts of children so that they can say, God, my Father. Therefore, my call to each and every one of you is to step into this issue. I'll just end with this one last thing. There's a great story about this guy. It was running down a beach one day, and he looks out in the distance, and he sees another guy kind of standing there by the beach, and he's throwing stuff in the water. And as the jogger gets closer, he's like, what the heck is going on with that guy? And as he gets closer, what he notices is that the guy is throwing starfish in the water. Well, as he surveys the beach, there are hundreds of starfish all over the place, and there's just one guy. So sort of incredulously, he kind of jogs by the guy, and he says, you're never going to save all these starfish. And the guy that's throwing the starfish in the water reaches down, and he throws one out, and he says, I saved that one. Yeah, it's 24 million kids. There's no question about that. But each and every one of us has an impact to do that. If you're dad, step into the gap. Be the kind of dad your kids need you to be. But also reach outside of your circle. And you don't have to join Big Brothers, Big Sisters. It's a wonderful group. You can just look within your own circle of influence. As they say in the black community, Bebe's kids. You ever heard that before, Bebe's kids? You know who they are. They're bad kids. Well, they're in your family. They need you. You have to step out. Just step in. If you're a mom, support dad in this role. It's critically important. Teach your boys and your girls what it means to have involved, responsible, and committed fathers. Let's make it a requirement in our culture. One by one. Thanks very much.